and good morning. We're going to go ahead and get kicked off. Thank you again for making the time to join us for our Lunch and Lead. Good morning, and as you're joining, if you could share your name, your organization that you're with, and the role that you play in that organization. Good morning, students, parents, guardians, educators, and community members. Welcome and thank you for joining the Charting the Course to Equity Coalition's Lunch and Lead Community Action Call. My name is Dr. Laura McGowan Robinson. I am founder and CEO of Diversity and Leadership Institute, or as we also are known as DLI. I'm a proud member of the Charting the Course to Equity Coalition. We'll host Lunch and Lead calls on a monthly basis over the next several months as a means of convening and activating community leaders from across the state around issues of cultural responsiveness, diversity, equity, and inclusion in public education. Each month, we will feature new speakers, discussion topics, and action items. Today, we'll discuss the role of empirical research in combating anti-Blackness in K-12 public education. The Charting the Course to Equity Coalition was established and facilitated by DLI in 2019. We are a diverse and powerful network of 16 local and national organizations with California presence that believe that school leaders, racial diversity, and culturally responsive leadership are critical levers in creating successful schools. The function of the coalition is to support and advance the mission of DLI through the development of key initiatives carried out by our four major objectives. They are contributing to and highlighting research on the topic of racially diverse leadership in California, K-12 education leadership, identifying and amplifying exemplary Black and Brown educators who have demonstrated success in closing the equity gap for students of color, to move from theory to action by seeking partnerships across the state to enhance existing educational leadership programs in preparing, supporting, and retaining K-12 school leaders of color, engaging in collective advocacy to affect the legislation and policies that impact Black and Brown students and educators. So to get us started, I will just share the names of all of our coalition partners, organizations. And so as I am doing that, I invite our coalition partners to shout themselves out, let us know you're in the room through the chat. And we'd love to just give you quick recognition. So first, the Diversity and Leadership Institute, myself and a few of our staff and supporters who are here in the space, welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge Loyola Marymount University School of Education, ACSA, the Association of California School Administrators, the United Negro College Fund, UNCF, Innovate Public Schools, CCSA, California Charter Schools Association, Teach for America, Los Angeles, the National Charter Collaborative, Education Board Partners, EDLOC, also known as Education Leaders of Color, Center for Powerful Public Schools, Education Trust West, Families in Action for Quality Schools in Oakland, Black Educator Advocates Network, also known as BEAN, JLC Social Impact Consulting, and Educators for Excellence, Los Angeles. I'll give you all a minute just to drop your organizations or just say hey in the chat. So happy to have you all here in the space. Again, these Lunch and Lead calls are for you and for us all to engage and learn and leave equipped with information to act. So today, we invite you to do just that. We hope that you learned something today and can leave with solutions and action steps that we can all take to combat these concerns. We thank you for being here with us today. And now I'd like to invite all of you again to shout out your name if you haven't already, and also share your city that you're representing, schools or school districts or organizations in the chat. Love to see which geography we have represented here. All right. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Ward Jackson. I see you, and Senior Director for Humanities and DEI for Envision Education. Thank you so much for joining us. Carla Lopez Valdez, Director of Family and Community Engagement for Center for Powerful Public Schools. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Angie Barfield, all the way joining us from Fresno County, Superintendent of Schools and co-founder of Black Students of California United. Welcome, so glad to have you. Elisa Santino, Program Director at the Joseph Drown Foundation. Thank you for joining us, and so many more. Esther Perez, Natomas Unified. I see folks all over the state here for this very important conversation. We got folks from Sacramento. I'm so glad to see you all here. We also invite you to engage on socials throughout the event by using the hashtag Lunch and Lead. You can also retweet about the Lunch and Lead at DLI_Institute. Shout out all the other organizations who've been named who are part of the Charting the Course to Equity Coalition. We invite you to tell your friends and family members to join the conversation now. So to kick us off this morning, we have Jaleesa Johnson, founder of Black Educator Advocates Network, BEAM, and a member of the Charting the Course to Equity Coalition, to introduce our presenter first, and then she'll also come back and introduce our panelists for the day. So please join me in welcoming Jaleesa Johnson.
Good morning, everyone. First, we will hear from Jamie Estrada Miller from Estrada Darley Miller Group, LLC, and a key contributor to the Within Reach report, who will provide context about the empirical data collected and how it can be used. Please join me in welcoming Jamie Estrada Miller.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jaleesa. It's so good to see you and good to see all of you. I know that I see some familiar faces and having talked about this report before, but I'll go through the full presentation and just really looking forward to hearing the conversation with our other leaders in the space that will be discussing how to address anti-Blackness and empirical research. I want to start with saying, one thing I would hold dear in this conversation is, we know representation matters. One, the research is there, but we, from being a classroom teacher, from being an organizer, from being involved in the work of education, equity, and change for 15 years now, the having leaders that represent the students that we're really advocating for, that are being left behind, which are Black and Brown Indigenous students, that is absolutely essential. It's actually essential in all of our forms of government representation. But I want to center the call to action that Laura and other folks shared in bringing this call together, that it's also, we know that it's not enough, right? We know that sometimes we can get leaders of color into really important seats and just centering what just the harm that has been done by our Latino city council leaders, that it's really important for us to know that representation matters, but it's also not enough, right? It's necessary, but it's not sufficient, that we actually have to have the mindsets to really address anti-Blackness and address racism wherever it is, that it's not enough for us to just show up and advocate for our own groups and believe that that's somehow enough. So I just want to center that in that conversation, and I'm really glad that Laura has convened us to really talk about that today. But I'll go through the findings of the report, and I'm going to share my screen now. Here we go. So Within Reach, Racially Diverse School Leadership in the K-12 Education Pipeline in Los Angeles County. This is a report put together in collaboration with the Diversity and Leadership Institute, with Loyola Marymount University, with CCSA. I would say we were lucky enough to be the researchers that got to get all of the data and really put our mind around it. This is connected to research that I do at USC as well, around really thinking about representation in schools, but representation in all government systems is part of my research, and equity in all of my research. But really, this report was really focused in on Los Angeles County and some comparisons to statewide. We were lucky enough to really just put together all of the research that CCSA, that Innovate, that DLI, that other partners engaged in. And so I'll go through that now. You'll see we'll go through the report objective, why this work is so important, the findings, and then the recommendations. So on the objective for this report, the goal was to better understand the role that administrators of color play, but administrators in general play in cultivating supportive school climates for teachers of color throughout the state of California, and particularly focusing in on LA County. And you'll see some of the numbers in LA County and why that lens on this space was essential. And in order to do this study, we conducted a mixed method study to examine the importance of having administrators of color. because really what prompted this report for Laura and other team members was knowing the data is out there on, we have more teachers of color that stay in the profession when they're in schools that have administrators of color, right? That trend is showing up. And also the trend that schools that serve predominantly Black and brown students that have teachers and administrators of color actually do better. They do better on achievement outcomes. And you can actually see that across a variety of research reports in many different locations. We know that having an educator and administrator of color matters. And now where I feel like the next frontier of research is headed and where we need to be is actually examining how does that matter? What is it about the school climate and culture that administrators of color are setting that are creating more supportive places for our teachers of color to show up and thrive with our students of color? And so jumping right into the findings, so why LA County? The data that went into this report, the quantitative data that went into this report actually looked at results statewide. And looking at, where are the schools that have higher retentions, that have higher sort of longevity for teachers of color in the space? And where are the schools that actually have more administrators and teachers of color? And so I just want to highlight that within LA County, although by no means is LA County there in terms of really establishing parity at the school site level between Black, brown students and the educator workforce, it's not there, but it has made significant gains over the past several years. So I want to highlight this statistic here. In 2019, 73% of LA County students were Black or Latinx, but only 50% of teachers and 48% of administrators were Black and Latinx. And so the parity is nowhere near there, but compared to what this looks like statewide, there is something going on in LA County that we should look at, and there are bright spots, which was the focus of this report, to then really find those schools that were achieving higher for Black and brown students, and then also had Black and brown administrators that we could interview and start to see some of their practices. Here, highlighting how LA County compares to statewide, you'll see that there are more administrators of color, 14% of Black administrators, and then 34% of Latino administrators, 52% non-Black or Latinx, compared to statewide, that is 75% administrators who are non-Black or Latinx. When you look at the teaching workforce, you also see there's a higher percentage of teachers of color than there are administrators. It's very slight, but you'll see that when we look at Black representation among our educators, that is much lower across LA County than it is for Black administrators. So that's also something that's really important to dig into. What is it about the pipeline that is actually leading to higher numbers of Black administrators than there are teachers in our schools? And then if you dig into LA County, you'll see that there are few school districts that are actually driving these results. It's not the entire county. It's actually school districts like Los Angeles Unified and a few others that actually have higher representation of Black and brown administrators. And I'm conscious of the chat. I'm going to come back to those questions as I go, because I'm not able to really see all of them here. And then we wanted to make sure that we put the student representation numbers here front and center, so that we know that we do need to center this issue. And LA County does outpace the state when it comes to ethno-racial representation, but by no means are we there yet on really achieving parity at the school level and really making sure that all of our Black and brown children get to have a Black and brown teacher and administrator at some point in their educational trajectory. So then, as I shared these quantitative results statewide, we looked at, well, what is it about the trend? And I can hear a little bit of background noise here.
But goodbye. Okay.
That they're muted. Thank you. What the trends that we picked up here are that Black and brown, having an administrator of color actually was correlated with having more teachers of color that stay for a longer period of time. So this was the quantitative side of our analysis. We controlled for a lot of factors that would influence teachers of color retention at the school site level. And even with that, we were showing that there is a trend on having administrators of color that are retaining more teachers of color. So on average, schools with a leader of color in LA County had 13 percentage points more teachers of color, and they were staying for slightly longer periods of time, especially for Black teachers. So we are in an educator crisis, right? We know that staying in the classroom is incredibly difficult, and it is more so difficult for teachers of color because of the school environments that they are in, because of the demands in terms of the role itself, as well as pay. The demands are great. And we're actually seeing that there's a trend here. So it's something really important to look at. Moving forward, you wanted to dig into those bright spots. Where do we see where administrators of color are able to retain more teachers of color and also have strong academic achievement results? So we had a number of school sites where we dug into interviews with the administrators at those school sites in order to understand their practices better. And what we found is substantiated in the rest of the research that is going into administrator and educators of color at the moment, which is there's a reason why teachers of color will stay more in schools led by administrators of color. And these are the 4 larger trends that we found. Building an intentional school culture that fosters an environment in which teachers of color feel valued and a strong sense of purpose. Demonstrating a clear commitment to equity and implementing clear, deliberate, and equity-centered practices. So it's about how administrators of color are showing up and centering equity. Clear mission and vision that is fostering, affirming shared school-wide culture. This isn't happening in pockets, right? There's an entire school culture that's built that you can feel across classrooms. And elevating teacher voice and autonomy in school decision-making. A teacher voice and autonomy in school decision-making is a finding that is consistent across how you keep your teachers. When educators are treated like the professionals that they are, when they are empowered to lead in their classrooms and lead at the school site, they stay for longer periods of time. That is especially true for teachers of color because we know that there can be additional barriers they face, especially when they're in predominantly white school spaces and serving mostly kids of color. And so, right, this report, the findings are important, but more so, I would say what's really important is the work that you're all engaged in ensuring the pipeline of administrator and teachers of color sustain, that they grow, that we're finding ways to build sustainability and retention for administrators and teachers of color. And so the recommendations that come at a local system level is 1, track and monitor administrator of color recruitment and retention. Most of this data is really old. It's not even looked at the district-wide level. And I want to commend DLI for the work that they've done, especially in Los Angeles Unified, to center, let's set targets for how many administrators of color we should have, both Black and Latino administrators. Let's set those targets. Let's be clear about what they are and our progress toward meeting them. That is actually something that's now built into the strategic plan for LA Unified with Superintendent Carvalho, is looking at the educator diversity workforce, investing and implementing targeted research retention strategies, building out system-wide communities of practice, creating intentional pipelines, and supporting continued learning opportunities. For school site leaders, I would say 1, reading the report, there's a lot of rich information there around the practices that these particular administrators were front and center leading with that are leading to their better results. But this hits every single level of the school site. It comes from implementing restorative humanizing systems. It infiltrates how you work with students, teachers, and families to co-create shared mission and vision, and really building up advocacy and equity-oriented recruitment and retention best practices. And so I want to center again the message: representation is necessary. It is the bare minimum. We deserve to be leading the schools that our Black and brown children are present in, but it is not enough. And it is about how those leaders lead that allows these results to take place. And so I'll pause there, Laura, and Jaleesa, and turn it back to you.
Thank you, Jamie. Yes, it is clear that the data shows the impact Black educators have on student outcomes. And for the next several minutes, we will hear directly from leaders in California education about the importance of culturally responsive educators. We reached out to this group because they represent a gambit of expertise and experience in research and building intentional learning environments that support, develop, and organize racially diverse public schools to close the opportunity gap. This dynamic group of leaders will share their insight and vision for why they prioritize Black and Latinx representation. During the conversation, we invite you to comment and share your thoughts. So I'm going to invite all of our panelists. So please join me in welcoming Jamie Estrada Miller, Dr. Linda Tillman is Distinguished Visiting Professor at Loyola Marymount University, and Dr. Alicia Montgomery, CEO of Center for Powerful Public Schools. This session is moderated by the CEO of Diversity and Leadership Institute, Dr. Laura McGowan Robinson. Dr. Linda C. Tillman is a Distinguished Visiting Professor in the School of Education's Educational Leadership for Social Justice Doctoral Program. Dr. Tillman is a former public school educator with high school teaching and administrative experience. Dr. Alicia Montgomery has been a teacher, vice principal, network facilitator, and director in several school districts in Northern California. Presently, she is the executive director of the Center for Powerful Public Schools. Dr. Laura McGowan Robinson formerly served as the Chief Operating Officer at the California Charter Schools Association, which later spun off the Diversity and Leadership Institute. She founded and served as Executive Director of Crown Preparatory Academy, a middle school in South Los Angeles, and is the founder and CEO of Diversity and Leadership Institute. I'll pass it over to Laura to start the panel.
Thank you, Jaleesa, and thank you so much to Jamie, who walked us through that data. And much of our conversation will center around that, but also the experiences of this esteemed panel. I have the honor of moderating this panel of distinguished educators, researchers, and advocates. They all have extensive education experience and knowledge to share. And for the remainder of our time together, I'd like to dive into not only the Within Reach report, what also we've seen in our practices as it relates to the importance of culturally responsive leadership and ethno-racially diverse school leadership, and other research on the topic, on this topic as well. And using research on this topic to move us toward action. And I know that sometimes data and research can be shared, but it's sad when it's shared and put up on the shelf only to collect dust. So we want to talk about how we can put some action behind research and some of the experiences that maybe some of you've had in seeing that data become actionable. And so I'm going to dive in with our first question, which is very brief. I know we got a quick highlight of your bios, but if each of you could share with us for a minute about your work and specifically what brings you to the work around ethno-racially diversifying our education leadership pipeline. And maybe we can start with you, Dr. Tillman.
Hello to everyone. Greetings from Columbus, Ohio. I'm at the far end of this discussion. I was a classroom teacher and an administrator for a number of years before I became a professor. And one constant that I see in all of this, no matter how long we've been working towards this, trying to get it jump-started, is that there always seems to be a problem. That no matter what we end up doing, we can always still find a problem. So these systems, I think, that we study are designed, they're working like they're designed to work. You know, they're working for white children, they're working for white parents. And so what we have is many administrators who don't see a need for any change. Now, recently, you know, we've had this push for DEI, which has almost become a trend, I think. And many administrators do not want to do this. And so I think that's why you have so much sort of resistance to it. People are going to mess with it on the fringes of it. And so my work, what I'm trying to think about and look into is what are people doing where it does work? It's because there are places that it does work, but what are they doing where it does work? And how can that work be extended on a large scale, on a broad scale across the country? I'm impressed with the findings from the two research reports you did, the one we're discussing today, and also with charting the course to equity, because I think those results are generalizable, but somebody has to be studying them like you all have studying those things, using the empirical data.
Thank you, Dr. Tillman. I'm going to kick it over to Dr. Alicia Montgomery to answer that same question.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I was a teacher in Northern California and the only Black teacher on campus. I want to say for many years. And as I moved through districts, I was sometimes one of two Black educators. And I think as it relates to especially what we're talking about in terms of having a seat at the table, it's really about people understanding the perspective of others and really being aware that they're in the room with you so that they can yield to other opinions. For me, having seen many, many leaders lose their positions, move on to other things besides education over the years, the 30 plus years I've been an educator, a practitioner, has led me to seeking ways that we can solve this problem. And so no matter what position I've had throughout my career, this has been something that I have been engaged in. So was happy to be engaged in it as I moved to the Center for Powerful Public Schools, engaged in it at the state level when I was working for CCEC and AXA, and heavily engaged in it throughout my career. So, and I think it's because I want educators that look like me to be successful and to be cared for and to thrive. And I want children who look like my children to have the best education possible. They deserve the best.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Jamie Estrada Miller, thank you for leading us and setting the foundation for the discussion, and love to pass that question along to you as well.
For me, as I'm hearing from the other panelists, it's a very personal part of my own journey. So I grew up in South Central Los Angeles in a predominantly Black and brown neighborhood where our schools, actually in some ways I had both Black and brown teachers fairly on in my career. And Laura, I think that's some of the ways that you center this work is thinking, when did I actually have a teacher that was non-white? When was that first moment when I had a Black teacher, someone who looked like me? I want to make sure that my daughter has that opportunity. But in growing up in South Central Los Angeles, I grew up there at a time where schools were suffering from major disinvestment from the sort of long-term effects of really segregation that took place in South Los Angeles and how schools were desegregated. And I was actually bussed out of my school to a school out in the San Fernando Valley because my school was deemed failing for a number of years. And I got bussed out along with several other Black and brown students that got bussed out to predominantly white schools in other areas where we were supposed to have better opportunity. But what was really there was schools that had more investment over long periods of time, where we had teachers that could stay and that had better working environments to be in. And so for me, my research has focused on educator diversity as well as some of the other major issues that address educational equity. I've also been on the organizing side, both with teachers and parents around district change efforts when it comes to education equity. I would say diversity in schools is one of the major elements, along with other things that we know work in schools, right? And so that those two things have been at the center of my career and my research, as well as my organizing efforts.
Thank you, Jamie. And I actually think that's a really great jumping off point, given your rich history and being an Angelino and a mom. And what you want for your children, and as me, as I look in the eyes of my Black son and wanting to preserve that joy. My question to you is, why this report? Why now, right? Why now? And specifically, what is the unique perspective that the field can gain, particularly in conversations as we're talking about anti-Blackness, what we're seeing happening in our city right now? And it's not unique to our city. Let's just be clear. They just got caught. These are conversations that sadly are probably happening and informing the policy that we see, right? Because that's where, if policymakers hold these ideas, it comes through their policy making. So specifically, what is a unique perspective that the field can gain with the insight garnered from this report?
I would say, why now? First there's the before this harm that our Latino city council members created for our community, and specifically for the Black community and for LGBTQIA communities and the indigenous Oaxacan community. Before that harm, what was really important to me about this report and why now is that we've seen movement on the number of administrators and teachers of color over the past several years. There have been organizations statewide and locally that have been working on this issue, right? How do we get teachers and administrators of color up the pipeline? And so now we're getting to the level where we're seeing the percentages of numbers be at a place where we can really dig in and say, how is this different? How is this leading to different outcomes for our Black and Brown students when they have administrators of color, when they have teachers of color? And when we haven't seen as much progress? I think this is one of the questions that I've gotten, Laura, as I've reached out and shared some of the results of this report. Well, if we've actually seen some progress in how many teachers of color we have, why haven't we seen as much gain for Black and Brown students over the past few years? And I think right now is the time where we dig into those results. We have a fair amount of investments in administrator and teacher diversity that have happened. And how do we make sure we know what's happening? Are teachers of color experiencing schools in better ways now that there are more teachers of color, where people may be fortunate and not be the only Black or Brown teacher on campus? What are we seeing? So I think now is a really important time to dig in. That's pre what happened, and now post what happened. I mean, like I said before, I feel like this moment is so hurtful, especially in being a Latina woman that has grown up in a predominantly Black neighborhood that has changed, and the story of Black loss that comes in South Central Los Angeles in terms of the number of Black families that have had to move out of South Central Los Angeles, where it is now predominantly Latino. That causes pain, that causes hurt. And that causes even tension between Black and Brown communities to exist. And it is intentional work that it takes to unravel and build up those relationships and build healing over time. That has happened with many organizations. It's in South Central Los Angeles with organizers that are hitting the ground. And now a lot of that, I would say it's not necessarily that it's in question, because it's been going on over time. But we know that representation isn't enough. We need to question how leaders are showing up. And so that's why this report matters so much, because that's the education version of what's going on in our city. Representation matters. Sure, we can have a lot of Latinx teachers, but are they going to show up in anti-Black ways, or in addressing anti-Blackness, or they're actually going to sustain anti-Blackness in the classroom? Are they going to have similar expectations that we may have expected from non-people of color? And so I think it's really important to examine attitudes, and that's what this report is about.
Thank you for that response, and that brings up this need for this critical self-interrogation, and looking at ourselves in the mirror, and examining like the ugly parts that folks don't want to talk about, and bringing that forward so that we can actually have conversations about it, disrupt it, heal, and figure out how we can move forward. And I guess this question, as I think about the work that you've done, Dr. Tillman, given your work around racial bias, DEI, and I totally respect what you were sharing about kind of this, is this a trend? Is it, that we're seeing right now, and combating anti-Blackness. In your experience, have you seen empirical research not only inform, but shift and improve institutions and education systems approaches to diversity, equity, and inclusion? If so, how and what are some of those examples that you might want to bring forward? Because this is this critical moment that you referenced and Jamie talked about too. If so, how specifically, and what are some actions of note that you think might be applicable as we talk about some of the issues that we're seeing, not only locally, but when we're talking about diversifying educational leadership pipeline in California. And if not, then I'll go to the next question, but I'll pause there because that was a mouthful.
Well, I just want to piggyback on what the first speaker was saying. This is sort of ongoing things, your city council example. Right now on Twitter, there's a white man in Texas who told his predominantly Black and brown students, mostly male, that he was of the superior race. And so he wanted them to know that he was of the superior race and they were of the subordinate race. So these are the kinds of things that we have going on in schools all the time. And I would tell you that, unfortunately, if I'm sort of tracking the work of lots of my colleagues, former doc students, the work that they're doing on anti-racism, confronting bias, anti-Blackness, when I asked them just for this particular talk, I probably sent emails and texts to about 10 of them. And all of these people are constantly doing this work, but they all have the same sort of answer. They wish they could point me to sustained, positive examples of people doing this work. So they will have the consultants come out. They will have the consultants give them packaged programs. They'll have the consultants talk with teachers, administrators. But then when the consultants leave, that's when the work gets done, because it's done between the principal and his or her administrative staff and the teachers. So I'm sure that empirical data can inform, because your report on charting the course is an excellent example. California is the second largest K-12 school district in the country. So the results were that leaders of color have a positive effect on academic achievement, graduation rates, and suspension rates, especially for students of color. That's generalizable to other districts across the country, New York, Chicago, DC, where you have similar populations, similar characteristics. So I think that, I believe that this type of data can be useful, but then on the flip side, the resistance gets in the way. So we could think of the resistance as being something like interest convergence. Derek Bell, who was one of the founders of the CRT movement, coined the phrase interest convergence. And what he meant was, when it's good for white people, they'll be okay with it being good for Black people. So as long as it's good for white people, then they'll be okay with it being good for Black and brown people. One of the examples that's always used is Brown v. Board of Education decision, where at the time, many white people lauded that decision because it put United States on the map in terms of fairness, equality, equity. But then when white people said, oh, these kids are actually going to go to school with my kids, then the interests began to diverge instead of converge. And so we might think of it in terms of interest conversion. The system is working the way it's supposed to for white children. The system is working the way it's supposed to for white teachers. It's working the way it's supposed to for white administrators. And if they don't have to do anything, they won't do anything. Many of them won't. I shouldn't say all of them, but many of them won't do anything. Otherwise, we would have a clearer picture and a broader landscape of success. I mean, our talking points wouldn't be just, these isolated school districts that have achieved success. So I hate to be the pessimist, but equity directors come and leave very quickly these days in higher ed and in K-12. And so some of the things that when you're doing DEI work in a school system, these equity directors, they need funding and they need the power to do their work. They need to be able to do their work. The districts need to really put some really teeth into looking at the school cultures, the school climates, the school curriculum. And the data needs to be tracked consistently. So this is where reports like the ones that you have done in these last two come in as a model that other districts can use, tracking this data consistently over time. What do we need to do? One of my colleagues at Penn State, Ed Fuller, says, one of the real problems with increasing the pipeline of teachers and leaders of color is tapping, the word tapping. If I'm white, I'm going to tap a white teacher and a white person to be administrator. So the tapping model is one of the things that can get in the way of increasing the pipeline.
Wow, tapping. I can't tell you how many times I've heard tapping, how many times certain people have been allowed to be tapped who would not have otherwise have been tapped. I thank you for just that rich response, and so much to chew on. I wanna kind of follow that thread and think about this in terms of practitioners. And Dr. Montgomery, having been both a practitioner and being on the policy advocacy side, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. And the work that you do at the Center for Powerful Public Schools is dispelling the myth and narrative that low-income schools and high needs areas cannot be successful centers of high quality learning and community care. And schools across California could learn from the work of Center for Powerful Public Schools approach in creating an equitable, motivating learning environment. Could you give us some insight? You can talk about it from your organization's perspective, and how you work with educators across Greater Los Angeles to cultivate a community of innovative educators focused on equity, and what role has Black educators and administrators played? And if you have any, tangible advice or thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience who are looking to implement some of these things that we're talking about today.
Yeah, thank you. So, wow, Dr. Tillman, that was a lot to unpack. And I could probably unpack everything you said for like 3 hours. What I want to say is that the Center for Powerful Public Schools, we really believe that really 3 things are really important for students to be successful. One, they need high quality teachers and leaders. That means they got to be good at the pedagogy of teaching and leading. And sometimes it's just that simple. And teaching and leading students of color, right? Which means it might be different than teaching and leading other students. So that's really important. Secondly, students need access to a broad course of study. In the state of California, we have our 8 state priorities, and we often skip over the one little priority that's about a broad course of study. But what that means is students have access to high quality, a diverse education, and it's high quality, meaning they have access to all kinds of courses in high school and elementary, and that they're at high quality and that they are leading them to career and college success. And then lastly, they need their community. Education doesn't happen in a vacuum. So students need their family, and they also need their community behind them. And so how do we leverage those 3 spheres of the work to ensure that schools are successful? And so that's what we do at the center. We focus on those 3 spheres. We ensure that all 3 spheres are working really well in the school community. And we try to ensure that the leaders and the educators are getting the capacity to do the work so that when we leave, that the work can carry on. Dr. Tillman, you were so correct in saying, like, you get the trainers to come in, but then when they leave, the real work begins. We like to stand beside the educators when the real work begins. You can have anybody y'all want to come in and train them, but who's there through the implementation phase, and who is there to ensure that there's quality implementation of the work? So if there's some things I would say around really being good at this work is, remember, it's always a 2-track education. It's your own personal journey, and it's your knowledge and skill, right? So if you're not attending to both things, and I don't care if you're whatever you're learning how to cook, there's two things: your own personal journey around being a cook, just having those intuitions, right? What does the recipe involve is one thing, but how to really blend it together and when to blend the certain spices together, that's what makes the difference between somebody cooking the same exact recipe and coming out with, y'all done all did it before, y'all done tried to make mama's macaroni and cheese and yours don't come out the same because your mama done told you the ingredients, but she didn't tell you how to put it together. So that is the key piece about how we really need to bring this out and how we really need to make sure that everyone is putting the recipe together the same. And we're not really clear around implementation measures in terms of how does it look? What does it sound like? What does it feel like when we're implementing an improvement strategy? And so when we think about improvement strategies and implementing things to improve across our system, everyone in the system has to have the same picture of what success looks like. What does it look like, feel like, sound like when it is looking, when it's amazing, when all of the eyes are on full cylinder, all the engines are firing at full force. So that's really important. It's really important that that we think about in terms of culturally responsive pedagogy, that people have that 2-track journey, but not just have the journey, but be accountable for the journey. So it's not just okay that you attend unconscious bias training, but if you're not changing your decision-making practices as a result of what you've learned about your bias, then you haven't done anything, right? If you haven't changed how you provide instruction as a result of your culturally responsive pedagogical instructional training, then it is not going to make a difference if you don't make a commitment to change and people aren't holding you accountable to that change. So we go in and help and work side by side with folks to just help them keep themselves accountable for making the changes they need to make. So my advice is, 1, have really clear implementation measures. 2, ensure that there's both accountability for the personal journey and the pedagogical journey. You have to have both. And if you don't have both, you're not going to get anywhere, because if people aren't doing the inside work, and I always say this, if people aren't willing to be on a personal journey to be a more conscious, culturally conscious and relevant person, leader, educator, what have you, then they shouldn't be in education. Plain point blank. It's okay that you are starting at the beginning, but if you're not willing to take the first step and get on the journey, then get off the bus. That's what we need to be really focused on. And so that's what I would advise.
And I have
Thank you.
I have one
Yes,
point.
go ahead.
Laura,
Yes.
it makes me think of Dr. Montgomery, a particular story of a school in a report that I engaged in with Innovate Public Schools of identifying schools that were closer to closing the opportunity gap for Black and Brown, low-income Black and Brown students. We identified a school in Long Beach Unified, and I'll actually share this video because we did a video of recording the research process at this school in the chat in just a little bit. But it was the principal that facilitated that ongoing self-reflection for teachers, right? That it was the administrators that were holding space and accountability so that when teachers had data where there were gaps in their classrooms for Black and Brown students, that they examined that data, that they did it on an ongoing basis, but that they had the interpersonal conversation about what it meant to have the expectation that it's not Black and Brown students' fault that they're not performing well. It is, we haven't figured out how to do it yet, right? We haven't figured out how to change our classroom practice in order to sustain their engagement. And the principal had to have that journey for themselves first. How do I examine that as a school? How are we bringing our Black and Brown families together to the school site? And then they had to facilitate that for every single teacher in the school with other teachers as well, not alone, right? And our administrators are not saviors. They have very busy and very difficult jobs. But part of that self-reflection, if it's going to happen on an ongoing basis and examination, our administrators are at the center of sustaining that. And also organizations like yours, Alicia's, that are going on that journey with folks.
And Laura, I know you have other questions, but I do want to say this. We need to stop focusing resources on fixing our Black and brown children and focus our resources on fixing the classroom. So what you just touched on, Jamie, is exactly that. You know, we spend so much time talking about school climate. You know, LAUSD put several $100 million aside for Black students, and 80% of the funds are towards climate people, social workers, all that stuff. Our kids don't need fixing. It's the system that needs fixing. It's the education in the classroom that needs fixing. If we don't start putting our resources there, we're never going to solve the problem. And so I appreciate what you just said, Jamie. That's a really good. I hope you drop that video link in the link for everyone to look at, because that is a really important point. It really is upon us to change the classroom and not try to fix our kids, because ain't nothing wrong with my babies.
Right, exactly. Stop looking at them as things that need to be fixed or in the deficit. I agree. I bring my best to the school every day. I bring my only child, my best. I don't, as Dr. Howard Fuller says, we're not keeping our best kids at home and bringing you the other kids. We are giving you our best. We are giving you our best, our most precious. And so that's how we want you to treat them. I'm so sad that we're almost out of time, but I do want to have us end maybe with you, Dr. Tillman, with this question, and then we'll wrap up. But this is just, again, this is a series of conversations, and I hope that we roped you in and that folks will come back after this and have enjoyed this conversation. But maybe to wrap us up, Dr. Tillman, with this last question, what do you think we should do with this information? And the question here is, from where you sit, how might these findings be used from moving from within reach to in our grasp as it relates to the diversification and the culturally responsive leadership of our pipeline in LA?
Well, I'm not, they're real familiar with California schools, so I won't know who the person is to go to, but I think you have to keep knocking on the door until someone who has the authority, who has the wherewithal, who can get to the superintendent or the person who needs to be gotten to, and keep trying to get to them with this data, and to keep trying to get the conversation so that they are aware of the data, so that they know how you can help to move this forward in the district, so you get some sort of commitment to take this work into the schools and do it on the ground. As it was just said, the kids don't need fixing, it's the system that needs fixing. So how is it that you can get into the school system and help them to fix this? So I don't know the people that you would need to talk to, but I think you need to just keep asking and asking until you get someone to listen to you about this. Because I was a part of that Black student Black Student Achievement Program last year. And there's a lot of money that was put into that. And I'm wondering, how is that working? But someone with real data needs to be at the table. Shirley Chisholm says, if you don't already have a seat at the table, bring your folding chair and sit down. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And there are folks who are on this call right now who are organizing constantly, who are in policy advocacy positions, who are having the conversations. And I think that, to your point, Dr. Tillman, all of our collective efforts, strategically aligned, will move the needle. And quite frankly, to some degree, has already shifted practices and policies, not only in LA, but in some areas across the state, which we see. I think that continued focused attention is exactly what we need, and we cannot let up on the gas. We got to keep the pedal to the metal. I want to thank you all for a very thought-provoking discussion today. You all have brought forth quite a bit. Like, I could talk to you all I want to just call you back and just keep talking and figuring out what we need to do and what can we implement in our strategy. So join me in thanking our panelists, and we will now hear from another coalition member, Jennifer Childress, founder of JLC Social Impact, will share with you how you can stay engaged. And join me in welcoming Jennifer Childress.
Good morning, almost afternoon, everyone here in California. Wow, first of all, what a powerful conversation. Today, we discussed the role of research in combating anti-Blackness in K-12 public education. Excuse me, but as you have heard, today isn't just a forum for discussion. This is a call to action. And as it has been said, this work requires resources. So today we invite you to join arms with the Charting the Course to Equity Coalition in a campaign to secure $15.8 million in state funding. Now, this will serve two primary purposes. One, increase the pipeline of diverse K-12 public school leaders across the state. And number two, cultivate culturally responsive school environments through professional development with accountability targets for school leaders, and that centers anti-racism, anti-bias, and culturally responsive school leadership. This campaign will launch next year, January 2023, and we're asking all of you, your school communities, your organizations, your networks, to take action in support of this campaign. In the chat, we are including a link to a form where you can sign up to stay informed about the campaign and ways to get involved throughout the process. We really hope you will stay engaged with us. And now I'm going to hand things off to Saray Addison, DLI's Public Policy Fellow, to close us out.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, presenters, for your insight. Jamie, as well as panelists, for a lively discussion. Thank you to the audience for your engagement. I saw the chat and the encouraging words you all were sending to one another. I hope that you all will also share on social media the great insights that you've learned today. I hope that you all are leaving here informed and energized and equipped with the tools that you need to make schools more equitable and led by leaders who are culturally responsive and that reject anti-Blackness. I'd like to spend a special thank you to the Charting the Course to Equity Coalition and all the participants in this first Lunch and Lead community call to action. As mentioned, to stay in the loop about the work of DLI and the coalition, you can follow us on social media, sign up for our newsletter, or you can always visit our website at www.diversityandleadership.org. If you register for this event, you'll receive a follow-up email with a survey, which will also include some of the clips from our call that you all can share on social media. Have a great afternoon, stay safe, and keep fighting for schools that we deserve.